Hi, welcome to the lecture video on the legacies of the 1920s. We could look at the economic legacies of the 1920s. For example, the assembly line transforms American manufacturing during the 1920s. We could look at jazz music specifically. But what I'd like to do is look at a certain set of political and cultural changes of the era, changes that we kind of take for granted today. For example, in a way, the fact that I have short hair and that short hair is not really an issue today for women is a legacy of the 1920s. Although I owe my ability to wear pants to the 1960s and the 1970s, the cosmetics industry really takes off during the 1920s. Hemlines for women come above the ankle. For men are part of this story too. For men, we can trace back to the 20s a more casual, relaxed style of dress. The sports coat, for example, makes its entry during the 1920s. Looser pants in general are a product of this era. The big contrast that one can make is with the traditional styles of the late 19th century. So the parents, or more likely kind of the parents and the grandparents of the young people of the 20s. Because in the late 19th century, turn of the century, women were supposed to be much more modest. They were supposed to cover their ankles with floor-length dresses, wear ankle boots, because the sight of a woman's ankles drove men completely wild. Long hair was considered feminine, late 19th century. Makeup was associated with prostitution, very different from the 20s. Middle-class men dressed in much more somber, serious ways. Dark wool, stiff trousers, sort of tapered legs, not the more playful wear of the sort of college youth of the 1920s. So the transformations in men's and women's fashion during this era, the changes that young people especially were attracted to, were often seen as worrisome changes by older Americans who thought that the youth of the 20s were not serious enough, that they were too immodest, that they were out of control. And in a way, they were right. I mean, they were right about certainly having very different ideas about things. Young people seem to have different ideas, for example, about sexuality, whereas an older generation of people had assumed that women were sexually pure typically and even uninterested in sex. Surveys of young women in the 20s suggest that they thought women and men had similar sexual desires and sexual needs, that men and women were not radically different in that department. Despite the protests of older Americans, the break with many traditional notions of dress and about sexuality were complete in some respects. We see a big resurgence of some of these ideas in the 50s, ideas about sex roles, but the personal freedom of the 1920s, the emphasis on that never really quite goes away. We can see this theme of personal freedom, the expansion of personal freedom in the Great Migration as well. This was a topic of your book review essay for the Uprooted. That essay does a very nice job of explaining what pushed so many black Southerners out of the South, what propelled them to the North, which was an environment much different from the South, not just regionally, but also they were typically going to urban areas, industrial areas. So let me offer you a few ideas about why this migration is significant, what its legacies are. The first significance really is demographic. It's about populations. This is a huge population shift. The makeup of many American cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West changes really within the space of a decade. Places like New York City, Chicago, Oakland, California, each grow so much in terms of population that you have really by World War I, and certainly by the 20s, you have a black metropolis in Chicago, for example. You have a city within a city. By 1970, the majority of African Americans lived in the North, whereas at the beginning of the part of the 20th century, only 10% of African Americans lived in the North. As the author of the book under review puts it, people as diverse as James Baldwin, Michelle Obama, Miles Davis, Toni Morrison, Denzel Washington, Spike Lee, you could probably think of many others, anonymous teachers, store clerks, steel workers, and physicians were all products of the Great Migration. They were all children whose life chances were altered because a parent or a grandparent made the hard decision to leave the South. A second legacy then is that there's greater cultural expression. The opportunity for cultural expression is much greater in the North. In the North, one can sing, speak, sculpt, write, paint. You couldn't really do this freely in the South as a black Southerner. Now, it's not to say that the North is a promised land. The North poses all kinds of problems, but the migration north does bring a cultural rebirth, a renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, which you may be studying in your American literature class at some point. Black artists of all kinds, such as the poet Langston Hughes, the novelist Claude McKay, the jazz master Duke Ellington, they developed their talents, they advanced their crafts, they bestowed on us a wealth of material that continues to influence us, to electrify us, really. So finally, the black migrants in the North could do something that they could not do in the South, by and large, and that is vote. This is the third significance. In the South, the Klan and a host of legal mechanisms, such as the poll tax, grandfather clause, these sorts of legal mechanisms, had dramatically reduced the number of black men and women after 1920 who could vote. And so black men and women really can't vote in the South in any significant numbers. Politically, black Southerners then did not wield political power, at least in the usual sense of voting rights in the South. But in the North, over time, as those millions arrive in northern cities, black votes do come to matter. So that the 1948 presidential election, the 1960 presidential election, which you'll read about a little bit, I think, when we get to American Dreams, in other words, presidential elections on a national, this has national significance really, that they turn in part on black votes in the North. There's a new political significance there. There's a new political leverage that means it's now possible to see civil rights considered on a national level for the first time since Reconstruction. So the Great Migration contributes in its own way to the successes of the civil rights movement as they emerged, as those movements emerged to challenge Jim Crow in the South during the 1950s and 1960s. So the 1920s, which we kind of typically maybe see as a really carefree era, prosperous era, that's between these really serious eras of the World War I and the Great Depression. As it turns out, it's an important period in its own right, and it has shaped our own time and place. So I'll leave it at that. Have a very good week. Thank you.